Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Wait, what? Who am I? Let's try that again. Nvidia's first generation of RTX graphics cards were brutally slain recently, causing prices on previously high-end cards to fall hard. After impulsively selling my graphics card before the market floods and prices drop further, it occurred to me that even the radically reduced trade-in value of an RTX 2080 could still be enough to buy a pretty capable gaming PC in 2020. My name is not important. Like many owners of Turing architecture graphics cards, I watched Nvidia's Ampere launch with fascination turning to morbid horror. The power, and more importantly the price, was compelling. I turned to my once mighty MSI Seahawk RTX 2080 in disgust. Filled with loathing for this suddenly obsolete former flagship, I immediately began plotting ways to excise its tragic corpse from my system. Okay, so I might be exaggerating. In truth, I bought the card for just under £400 last year, a perfectly reasonable price at the time, but suddenly it felt like I'd woefully overpaid given the impending and massive depreciation. As the forthcoming RTX 3070 is likely to offer 2080 Ti performance for just £469, expecting to recoup my cost price was pretty unrealistic. This is where Cex comes in. Cex, spelt C-E-X, is a UK retailer that buys and sells used tech, and if you're an RG and HD fan, you're probably already familiar with them. Buying from Cex online is something of a lottery. Their prices range from suspiciously low to unfathomably high, and no photos are provided. Buying from them then is risky business, and selling to them rarely works out in the consumer's favour. In this instance, however, I was surprised at just how generous their exchange price on the RTX 2080 was. Thus, in a flash of inspiration, the idea for this video was born. I walked into my local Cex shop with an RTX 2080 and walked out with a credit note for £372, before setting myself the challenge of buying and upgrading a PC from their dreaded website with that amount as my total budget. As Cex doesn't sell motherboards or power supplies, my only real strategy was to buy a complete system. Although there were a few good options in the OEM pre-built category, I thought I'd take a punt at this invitingly spec'd custom-built Cex machine. On paper, it looked like great value. By my mental arithmetic, even in a worst case scenario, the £225 asking price was not too big of a risk. The platform is just new enough that the key components should be somewhere near the beginning of their life, and there's plenty of potential for upgrades. And there we have it, a quick transition later, and here it is, my Ryzen 3 1200 powered, air quotes, gaming PC in all its glory. And I have to say, I'm fairly impressed, though I'm aware as I say this, it's going to sound like some fairly low bars are being cleared. The power supply is branded, even modular. The case isn't a head-turner, but it has a ton of fans that are going to keep everything nice and chilly, and the advertised GTX 750 is exactly what it said it was, and not some rebadged Fermi card from Wish.com. Even more surprisingly, the AMD Ryzen 3 1200 I was expecting turned out to be a Ryzen 1200 AF. As well as its very modern emphasis at the end of the model number, the 1200 as fuck is built on the 12nm Zen Plus architecture, which should mean for better performance and thermals compared to the processor I'd been expecting to receive. After quickly switching out the single 8GB stick of RAM for a pair of 4GB sticks, which is just good common sense, I decided to run it through its paces with the GTX 750 to get a baseline before I go hunting for something more powerful with my remaining credit. Kicking things off with the notoriously demanding and gorgeous new entry in Microsoft's long-running series, it's Flight Simulator. Okay, we'll come back to this one later, I guess. What's this? Did I put the wrong card in? I mean, this is shockingly good performance for such a budget card, and it's running pretty quiet, and oh my god, what the hell? So it turns out the fan in my GTX 750 is busted, which might account for why the previous owner had fitted side fans on the case. Still, despite thermal throttling a little once we hit the mid-90s, I'm really impressed with how GTA 5 on medium settings runs, even in 1080p. With a bit of engineering know-how, I managed to rig up a solution that at least got me through the benchmarks. Of course, GTA isn't as cutting edge as it once was. Destiny 2, however, is pretty demanding for a cross-platform title, and while frame rates weren't unplayable, I think we might do better with a new card. I'd certainly do better playing a first-person shooter with something other than a controller. With settings adjusted to something suitably competitive, the ever-popular Fortnite runs as smoothly as you could ask for. Turning up settings like shadows, anti-aliasing or view distance makes things a little less buttery, however. So let's check in on Flight Sim. Nope, still loading. Epic's free-to-play Monster Hunter clone allows its graphics settings to be adjusted with a minimum of fuss, with most of the adjustments able to be handled with a single slider. Near the top of the scale, we are barely hanging on to a playable 30 frames per second. Dropping down to the middle of the range and we see something a little bit more playable. Okay, wrapping up the PC titles with Flight Simulator, and as you can finally see, even at the minimum setting, it's a veritable slideshow. I'm using external capture, so this is exactly the kind of performance you can expect from an older entry-level card like a GTX 750. If you really want to try this one out on your potato PC, I believe Low Spec Gamer has a video on this very topic. Finally, as my current obsession with emulators is as strong as ever, I thought I'd give Breath of the Wild a bash. Cemu, a Nintendo Wii U emulator, has had an incredible amount of development and optimization done over the last few years, to the point where it runs decently on even this setup at 720p, which is of course the Wii U's native resolution. Taking things up to 1080p, however, seems to be a challenge too far. Even though the CPU was pegged at 100% in both cases, if you're planning on trying this yourself, I'd advise you to find and download a pre-made shader cache to avoid the stutters you're seeing on screen now. With about £150 of my credit remaining, I headed back to the website to see what Sex had that could appeal to me. In a system intended for productivity, I could have maybe exchanged the Ryzen 3 1200 for something more powerful like a Ryzen 5 1600 or even a Ryzen 7 1800X, and maybe splashed out on an extra 8GB RAM stick. Or, as a quality of life measure, I could have looked at an SSD to partner the 1TB hard drive. However, as this is strictly a gaming PC, I decided to do something about the pygmy elephant in the room, the biggest bottleneck in my otherwise promising system, the GTX 750. With my £150 budget, a 500-watt power supply with only a 6-pin PCIe connection for some reason, and with only Sex's selection to choose from, I settled on the Nvidia GTX 1650 Super. For exactly £150, this ironically Turing-based refresh of the GTX 1650 should give me the performance boost I'm looking for within the constraints of the challenge. GTA 5 on the GTX 1650 Super feels, oddly enough, almost like overkill. I didn't max everything out, but at least at 1080p, I feel like I could, and would still have a playable experience. With the 1650 Super installed, Destiny 2 is a very different beast, enjoying some very high frame rates while leaving plenty of room to turn up the visuals. Controllers still aren't the way forwards though. I decided I had more than enough horsepower to play with in Fortnite that I could afford a few more luxurious visual options. Although I'm playing through a 30 FPS capture card, a fact on which I blame my terrible gameplay, and nothing else, overall play is noticeably smoother, although the occasional stutter during early stages is likely down to the relatively low thread count of the processor. Gamers on a budget can probably learn to live with this. Dauntless certainly benefits from the extra power of the GTX 1650 Super, though honestly the game looked pretty good at medium or high settings. The frame rate is certainly smoother, especially in busier areas. Switching cards makes a massive change in performance in Flight Sim, and if this game is on your wishlist, you should definitely be thinking of getting a modern graphics card to go with it. Sadly, looking this good doesn't come cheap, and I personally would be more inclined to go a little bit higher still in order to really extract the most enjoyment from this title. Wrapping things up then, the graphics upgrade doesn't seem to do a whole lot for Breath of the Wild, barely grazing 60 FPS in 1080p, with the CPU still sticking to 100% utilisation most of the time. A consistent 60 frames per second experience at 1080p would benefit from a step up to, say, a hyper-threaded 4-core or a 6-core. Performance then is a bit of a mixed result. Some games were essentially made playable by the GPU upgrade, whereas others needed a more holistic approach to upgrades. Maybe splitting my upgrade budget between, say, a Ryzen 1400 and an RX 480 would have made more overall sense. Though that would also have required a new PSU, which again was outside the scope of this project. So this wasn't exactly a consumer advice kind of video, and you most definitely shouldn't take it as such. For the same £375 budget, there are plenty of other spec options out there. In fact, it might be an interesting topic for another video. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see my take on a £375 system. With the actual factual launch of the RTX 3080 fast approaching, the GTX 1650 Super is going to live in my main PC until my new card arrives, whereby the lower powered unit will go back into my sex machine and probably end up on eBay. Hope you enjoyed this departure from my usual list videos. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.